For meeting with us. Peter Schiff, we've come to see you because you've become quite, I say, notorious in the world of financial commentary. So what was it that took you from simple, plain old stockbroking to the fund manager that you are now?
Well, I guess I was more of a traditional stockbroker in, the early to mid 1990s. I was buying, American stocks predominantly for my clients. Sure, philosophically, politically, I was still libertarian, but I was, recommending U.S. stocks, and it really wasn't until the latter 1990s during the tech bubble where I thought this is nuts. I couldn't believe the prices that people were paying, the pie in the sky valuations for companies that I knew would never survive. I mean, I knew these business models of these dot-coms. Not only would they not justify the valuation, I didn't even think that they could survive. I thought they were going to go out of business. And so I initially was worried about what would happen to the U.S. economy when this tech bubble burst, because I saw a lot of resources going into tech, a lot of jobs, and a lot of malinvestments. And so not only was I worried about the excessive valuations, but I was worried about the economic implications for the economy when this tech bubble burst. But then what happened when the bubble burst in 2001, and then we had the September 11th terrorist attacks, I was very surprised at what Alan Greenspan did. He slashed interest rates down to 1%, and I thought that was a mistake. And I saw the impact early on in 2002, 2003, that policy was having on the housing market. And I said, wait a minute, the Fed is doing a lot more damage now. So now I ended up having to move even more money offshore because now I sensed an even bigger crisis. And I was no longer bearish on the U.S. stock market because I saw that the Fed was putting a floor beneath asset prices by printing money. But I thought the dollar decline would negate those gains, and therefore I wanted to invest abroad, and I wanted to invest in gold, and I wanted to invest in commodities. And of course, we had a huge run because when I started buying gold in 2001, it was under $300 an ounce. It rose as high as $1,900 by 2011. I started buying oil. It was $20 a barrel or less. It went up to 150. The dollar lost half its value during that time period. The euro doubled. The New Zealand dollar doubled. A lot of these currencies went way up. And I made a tremendous amount of money during that time period. And then, of course, I made money in 2007 because I was short the subprime market. That was another thing that I did, is we set up a hedge fund in 2006 to short subprime. But then, when the 2008 crisis happened, now again, once again, the Fed did everything wrong. Bernanke did even larger mistakes. He set the country up for an even greater fall. So this process has been ongoing. It started off as my being concerned about the tech bubble, then the housing bubble, and now the everything bubble, whatever you want to call what we have now, because we have a bubble in housing, a bubble in stocks, a bubble in bonds, a bubble in, in student loans, in automobiles, in credit cards. I mean, you name it, the Fed has created a bubble in it. And so this is much more dangerous, but I have been, trying to stay ahead of the Fed this entire time. And this whole process has been evolving. And, it's not going to end well.
Let's talk about the politics of it. So you're a fund manager at the moment. You have dabbled with politics. You ran for Senate in Connecticut. You worked with Ron Paul on his presidential campaign. Are you a potential politician? And does that mix with economics anyway?
Well, I don't know if I'm ever going to be a politician. I don't think I was being much of a politician when I ran for office the last time, which is probably why I didn't win. When you're playing politics, it's all about telling the people what they want to hear rather than telling them what you think they need to hear. And so it's difficult for me to actually, be a politician, but that doesn't mean I may not run for office again in the future. You never know what the future may hold. And certainly if the U.S. economy evolves in the way that I believe that it will, I think things are going to get pretty bad in the United States. And hopefully they'll get to the point where people are really interested in a different direction, where people will lose confidence in government to fix their problems and try to think about solving their own problems and having a government that simply gets out of the way and makes that possible. And, a lot of people, when they voted for Donald Trump was promising to make America great again. And I'd love my country to be great again, but I realize that no leader is going to do that. That if we're going to reclaim our greatness, We need to reclaim our freedom. And so what we need is a government that lives within the confines of the Constitution, and we need to restore limited government, sound money, economic freedom to the United States. And if we can get back to those traditional values of individual liberty and freedom and small government, then collectively the American people can make the country great again.
President Trump was elected on the notion that he understood, or a lot of his mandate, his voters understood, that he recognized that they've been left behind by globalization, that they've been left behind by the economic system that you describe now. So do you recognize, in your view, a positive step that President Trump is a sign that those concerns are being taken on board now in the political body?
Well, Trump tapped into the vein of discontent, and you know, he said a lot of things when he was running for office that are very similar to the things that I've been saying, as far as how bad the economy is and how the phony statistics kind of cover up what's really going on, and that got him a lot of votes. But what he didn't do, and maybe this is why he is president, is because he didn't actually level with the voters as to the difficult road ahead if we actually want to get back to genuine prosperity. Donald Trump made it sound as if all he needs to do is renegotiate some trade deals and cut taxes, and America is going to be great again. That it's simply a function of having the wrong leaders. That if we just had a smart businessman running this gigantic government, that everything would be better. And that's not the truth. We don't want to run a gigantic government. We want to dismantle a giant government. I mean, he's found a lot of people to run these government departments and agencies. I'd rather him find these people to shut down these government departments and agencies, because they're not going to run it any better than the bureaucrats who ran it before. And Donald Trump did not prepare anybody for any type of short-term sacrifice. He was just going to make everything better instantly. And I'm afraid that a lot of people are going to be disappointed when that does not happen.
So you really would welcome the arrival of something cataclysmic that would change the entire political system?
Well, I don't know about cataclysmic, but sometimes when you have a problem, let's say you have a drinking problem or a drug problem, usually you don't get around to doing anything about it until you hit rock bottom, right? Maybe a guy has lost his job and his wife has left him before he finally admits he has a problem and is willing to do something about it. So we have a serious problem in the United States, and I do believe that it's going to take a bigger crisis before we actually do anything about it. As long as the world is foolish enough to keep lending Americans money, Americans will keep spending it, right? As long as the government can keep going into debt, as long as the Federal Reserve can keep interest rates artificially low so that we can keep this house of cards economy from collapsing, that's what we're going to do.
Much of Peter Schiff's economic philosophy is rooted in a deep mistrust of big government, in particular income tax. In a moment, we talk about his father, Irwin Schiff, an anti-tax campaigner who died in a federal prison. It's easy to identify Peter Schiff's setup as some sort of self-imposed exile. He sees it differently. So was Puerto Rico always on your radar as a place that you might move to live, or you explored? Or?
No, it was never even on my radar at all until I read about John Paulson and the things that he was doing down here and some of the tax incentives that had recently been enacted. So I hadn't even thought about it. I mean, I had been thinking for a long time about getting out of the Northeast, getting out of Connecticut, because the winters are long and cold, and the taxes are high on a state level as well as the federal level. So I had already been thinking about moving out of Connecticut, but I wasn't thinking of Puerto Rico. I mean, it wasn't something that you would naturally think about. I'd only been here once in my life, and it was in my 20s. I came one time for a vacation. But I had been thinking, and even before I moved my asset management company here, though, I was thinking about moving it to Singapore or to Ireland. So when I found out about Puerto Rico, I changed that. So that caused me to move my business to kind of a local tax haven rather than going to Europe or Asia. But then also move here myself rather than just moving to Florida. I just went a little bit further.
But Peter Schiff is at heart the consummate outsider, going against the grain, doing things differently. It's a trait that many might say he inherited from his father, Irwin, who died in a federal prison protesting against federal tax laws.
How much of his views play a part in the way you run your business now and how you view the financial situation now?
You know, he was the child of, Jewish family in Connecticut, very much FDR supporters, traditional liberal Jewish family, blue collar. His father was a carpenter, first generation American. So my father was the first in our family to be born in America, or his generation. His parents emigrated from Eastern Europe. But all of his understanding of economics, he got on his own, not because, he studied it in college. No, what he learned in college was your traditional Keynesian nonsense. So he was able to educate himself and read and come to an understanding of economics. And ultimately, though, he started to study the Constitution, he started to study the tax law, and when he became convinced that the government was collecting the income tax in violation of law, not only in violation of the Constitution, but in violation of the Internal Revenue Code, he really became the nation's foremost tax protester. But he really wasn't protesting taxes. He was protesting the illegal manner in which the government went about collecting taxes and enforcing taxes. And he, self-published many books that became bestsellers, and he developed the rather substantial following nationwide. People who, read his books. Not everybody necessarily followed his advice as far as defining.
Well, some did, and they got into trouble, didn't they?
Some did, some didn't. I mean, I've run into a lot of people who stopped paying income taxes and never had a problem. But then there were others who did. And certainly my father had a problem because he was so high profile. The government had to make an example of him. And that's why he ended his life as a political prisoner. I mean, my father was very sincere in his beliefs. And you can question whether or not his beliefs were accurate, but you can't really question the sincerity with which he held them.
But you have this view that you've carried on, I suppose, a legacy in a way, that small government is the way things need to operate as much as possible. But how small would you like government to be?
Well, as small as possible. I mean, I think it's so small that maybe you could drown it in a bathtub. But, I like government to be limited. That is the very foundation upon which this nation was built. I mean, the reason America became the richest nation in the history of the world was because we had the smallest government. And if you look at any examples today, if you look at countries that enjoy high standards of living, it's those countries that have succeeded in reigning in government. And it's only when government grows and increases its power that standards of living decline. And you could look at all sorts of examples where you could look at countries where you have a North and South Korea, or first China and Hong Kong, or China and Taiwan, or look at East Germany and West Germany. Whenever you take a culture and kind of split it, where you have more government on the one hand and more freedom on the other, it's always the country with more freedom and less government that has more prosperity.
The volume is getting louder in terms of people commenting on economic affairs, and as a consequence, politics as well. Are these the two forces at work in the United States starting to announce themselves now through economic commentary?
Well, I think maybe the internet and the fact that people now have a bigger voice than they used to, when all you could do is turn on the television and see what's on CBS or NBC. I think that the internet has more democratized this type of information, and people have a venue. I mean, somebody like me, if there was no internet, how would I be able to reach the number of people I reach unless I was able to go through a mainstream media outlet where I had, just 5 minutes of sound bites, and not even that, because I'll be on cable television for 5 minutes, yet there are 2 or 3 other people on at the same time as me, and you try to get a word in here and there. But on the internet and with social media, I can get a lot of my opinions out there, and so can other people, and people can, comment on my YouTube channel, or they can engage one another on my Facebook page. So I think that's happening more now that people have the means with which to express themselves and to learn more, right? You have information that you can avail yourself of. It's so easy to get information now through the internet that more people are able to educate themselves and to understand the truth when it comes to economics and government.
According to Peter Schiff, the collapse of the US economy is not only a certainty, it's also long overdue. In a moment, we'll be talking about where he says investors should take their money to weather the coming storm.
Although the daily commute is a golf cart through lush gardens and manicured lawns, Peter Schiff admits it's a full-time job.
And are you working all the time? I mean, are you the kind of person who doesn't take holidays?
Well, it's hard to, because I have a cell phone, so people can always call me.
He's not showing any sign of giving up soon.
So do you anticipate working hard for the next 20 years?
20 years is a long time.
Time enough to contemplate the possible impact of his predictions on ordinary Americans.
What should they do, the man in the street, the ordinary guy? What should they do with their investments right now? They'll be fearful if they hear these kind of predictions.
Well, the average man on the street doesn't even have any money to invest. That's the sad reality. I mean, most Americans are broke. So to the extent that the average American has any money left over whatsoever, I would, suggest they buy some gold or buy some silver. I mean, don't put your savings in a bank. I mean, you're going to get no interest on it. The government's going to keep printing money. Either the bank is going to fail and you're going to lose your savings, or they're not going to fail because they get bailed out by the Federal Reserve and your savings lose their value. So for most people, to the extent they have savings, they need to save honest money, and they can do that with gold and silver. But for people who do manage to have a more substantial net worth, people who have retirement accounts, pensions, 401ks, people that have real portfolios, what my advice has been for some time is to try to recognize how these problems are going to impact the value of U.S. assets, not simply the nominal price of stocks or bonds, but the real value of these assets and the real value of the income that they're able to generate. And so I help my clients invest globally, move outside the United States, but also to try to avoid some of the other nations that are also having problems that will lead to higher inflation and a loss of purchasing power of their currencies. Try to find those countries that are making the fewest mistakes and then try to invest there.
So why gold particularly?
Well, because gold is real money. I mean, gold is something that central banks can't create. And, ever since we went off the gold standard, the dollar has been declining in value. If you go back, to the beginning of the Federal Reserve and look at what the price of gold was back then and look at what it is today, I mean, the dollar has lost, 98, 99% of its purchasing power relative to the price of gold. I mean, the price of gold has been pretty consistent throughout history. And so if you want to preserve your purchasing power, if you're worried about inflation, which is, of course, really just a government tax, if governments are going to create money to pay for their spending rather than pay for it legitimately through taxation, then you're going to pay through a loss of purchasing power. And if you want to protect yourself, you can protect yourself with gold.
And you're not a fan of Bitcoin?
Well, Bitcoin is an attempt to try to provide an alternative to fiat currencies. And I don't think it's going to work. I mean, I don't think that these digital currencies that are also backed by nothing, that have no intrinsic value, and where there's no limit to the number of digital currencies that can be created, I don't think they're going to work. Now, right now, they are working as a speculative asset. Certainly people who have speculated in Bitcoin, who bought Bitcoins, they have tremendous profits on paper, and some of the people have actually realized these profits by cashing out. But just like I believe that a lot of these .com companies had flawed business models and would never achieve what they were promising, that didn't prevent people from profiting on the mania until it collapsed. But right now there's a lot of hype surrounding the potential, just like there was a lot of hype surrounding the potential of a lot of the .coms, but I don't think it's going to be realized. Now, ultimately, do I think there could be digital currencies that could be issued privately and circulating? Absolutely, but they need to be backed by real money. So you can have a digital currency that's backed by gold, but you can't have a digital currency backed by nothing. Just like you can't have paper currency backed by nothing. When paper currency was backed by gold, it worked. It's only when it's backed by nothing that it doesn't.
What identifies a country out there beyond the shores of the United States that you would consider is not making mistakes?
Well, they're all making mistakes, unfortunately. That's kind of the way things are today, because they're all following a bad example, right? Everybody is reading from the same bad playbook, so they're making bad decisions. But there is no free market paradise anywhere on earth. I mean, I don't think any countries today are really as free as, let's say, 19th century America, early 20th century America. But if you look at countries like Hong Kong, like Singapore, like New Zealand, like Switzerland, and these are some of the more developed economies, there is more freedom than government control.
How do you feel about the people out there listening, living their lives, trying to make a buck, regular folks? Are you concerned for them, or are you simply pushing your own point of view because you believe in an economic way that it's right?
Well, of course. I mean, I am very concerned about it, and I'm trying to help people both financially by protecting their own wealth, the money they've saved, and I'm trying to educate people. One of the things that I did that touched a lot of people was when they had the Occupy Wall Street protests. I went down to Zuccotti Park, and I had a cameraman with me, and I had a sign, I'm in the 1%, let's talk. And I engaged these individuals for a couple of hours and talked about their concerns. And I recognized the problems that people have. I just thought that they were expressing their anger at the wrong source, that everybody wants to pretend that the solution is government, that individuals or businesses or entrepreneurs are evil and greedy, they're going to exploit the workers, they're going to gouge the consumers, and the only benevolent force out there is government. And that is a very dangerous perspective, because government is brute force. Government can force you to do things. They can put you in jail, right? They can imprison you. They can take your money by force. No businessman can do that. If a businessman wants your money, he has to earn it.
Yeah, but market forces can be pretty cold-blooded as well.
No, they're not. They're fair. Market forces work, and they work fairly for everybody. And I also believe in compassion, not of government, but of individuals. I'm not so naive as to say that in a free market, there aren't going to be people that fall through the cracks, that have certain mental incapacities or physical ailments that prevent them from even feeding themselves or take care of themselves. But I have confidence in individuals, that individuals will take care of their fellow man.
Looking at America as an example, looking at how the Federal Reserve does business, looking at the central banks in Europe as well, for that matter, what's your advice for them? What warnings or what lessons to learn?
Yeah, well, to do the opposite of what we're doing. We're setting a very, very bad example. A lot of people look to America and they want to emulate America. But America is great, or was great, not because of what we're doing now, but because of what we did in the past. I mean, we've been spending the last 50 years or so undoing all those good things. So to the point that, we're like the dumbest kid in the class, yet everybody wants to cheat off of us because they think we're so smart. Well, I mean, obviously, if you're cheating off the dumbest kid in the class, you're not going to get a good grade. So you really don't want to follow in our example.